Jyotish, would you speak about what it, excuse me, would you speak about what it means on how to concentrate on an aspect of God if one is not in the state of feeling love, seeing light, or hearing sound? How does one
How does one go about
how does one about oneself
absorb?
absorb oneself into it? To think about it, it seems to me, takes us into words, concepts, and the mind. Thank you. That's a very good question, in fact. Um, Obviously, when we begin to meditate, and I mean in each meditation, not when we're new to meditation, but when we're meditating, we don't go full blown into the final experience that we're after. It's a kind of a cumulative or gradual thing, although for some it's less gradual than for others. Master said somebody was doing 1,000 kriyas a day, and he said 1,000 kriyas a day, 2 or 3 ought to be sufficient. But of course he did advise others to do lots and lots of kriyas, so it was more particular advice for this person. In other words, to go deep and not just to count on quantity to get you there. Okay, coming back to this question. Let's, for the sake of example, because Master used this example, talk about joy. So after we have practiced our techniques, let's say, done our kriyas, and we're focused and concentrated deeply at the point between the eyebrows, it's not only the point of light, but it's also the point of joy. And so let's say, for the sake of this discussion, that we're trying to concentrate on joy and become, as the questioner said, absorbed into the experience of it. Well, it's hard to go from no feeling of joy into complete absorption in joy. So take it a step at a time. In fact, it may help at the beginning to affirm joy. Affirm it in something like, from joy I came, in joy I live, in sacred joy I melt again, a chant that we have done over and over again in the community. But if you're really trying to get absorbed into joy, yes, it starts with words, but you have to go beyond the words in order to get into the real feeling of joy. So Swami has often used the example that the spiritual path and spiritual evolution is like being on a ladder. No matter where you are, there's a step above and there's a step beneath. And it's your own ladder. You know, you're at a certain point. It doesn't do any good to compare yourself to other people's ladders. They may have their own challenges. So here, if you're not in a state of joy, the step above you is to affirm joy. And the step beneath you is probably to space out and start thinking about other things that aren't going to lead to joy at all. And so by affirming joy, such as in a chant, you begin to prime the pump a little bit. Then, as the pump is primed, you have to go beyond the priming aspect of it, and you have to begin to feel joy. So then, as you begin to feel the joy, actually feel the experience, then drop the technique, which is the affirmation that's leading you to that feeling, and try to continue deepening the feeling itself. Master actually used the image of take whatever joy you feel and try to expand it like a bubble. And so you feel that you're expanding and expanding that joy. You can use a visualization where the joy is like a light and it's expanding out, or just use the feeling. You can also feel in the heart. Feelings are generally felt more in the heart. But concentrate on joy in the way of feeling and receptivity. In another sense, that joy that you're feeling is, even though you may be priming the pump, you aren't creating that joy. It's like, another example that comes to mind is if you're wanting to listen to a radio station playing classical music, you may have to spend some time tuning the dial to get the right station. Tuning the dial is not listening to classical music, but unless you tune the dial, you're not going to get that station. Once you've got the station, then don't sit there and play with the dial. Back off and just listen to the music. And so it is with any of these qualities. You may have to use an interim step to get into it, but then try to get past verbalizing and past mentating about it, and try just to get into the feeling of it. Deeper meditation comes primarily through feeling. Real meditation or real perception comes through intuition. And intuition is not just mind-born. It isn't just thought. It's a combination of an aspect of consciousness in the mind, a buddhi or discrimination, and feeling nature. It's wisdom and feeling together that produce intuition. And so you try to get calmer and calmer. Another way of becoming absorbed in it is by depth, pure depth of meditation. You don't have to produce the joy. As you get deeper and the mind calmer and just more inward, joy is our natural state, and it will be there. And the same for all of these other aspects of God. Light will be there, sound will be there. After you've listened to Om many, many times, I'm sure that many of you have this knowledge that Om is always there. You don't always listen to it, but it's always there. And as soon as you turn your mind to listen to it, you just hear it. And likewise with some inner sense of inner light, it's there. And as soon as you concentrate on that, you become aware of it. So what I'm emphasizing here is that we don't create these things. They're there already. They're present. We just tune into them. And the more deeply we tune into them, the more deeply we become absorbed in them.
In the effort to go through as many questions as we can, we both won't comment on each one. We'll just move through them. So this question has two parts. The first one is, number one, deep, long meditation. How is it possible to balance our life of service with longer meditation? Sometimes in our daily routine, there's barely time for our regular one. Well, there's two aspects to this. I think it's more important to work on deeper meditation than longer meditation. If you work on deeper meditation, the longer meditation will take care of itself. And so if you can, all the things that we've been talking about in many of the classes, and if you haven't been able to come to the classes for, jobs and so forth, do listen to the tapes. They've all been recorded, and there's a lot of good information. But just putting out the energy as soon as you start to meditate. This is one thing Swamiji stressed that we haven't talked about previously in the week, that if with the very first breath, when you begin the Hong Sa technique, if from that moment on you catch the mind and focus it, then that it's sort of like a ice pick. It kind of establishes a hole, and then you can kind of move through that hole to the ocean of spirit beneath the frozen lake. So work on deepening your meditation. And the more deeply you meditate, the more you'll find time for longer meditation, because you'll begin to enjoy it. The other aspect about finding it in our daily routine, remember earlier in the week we were talking about Patanjali and how he said there were different obstacles to the spirit, to finding God. And one of them that Master talked about was carelessness. And this he explained as having a disorganized, disorderly life. He said, for the yogi, your life should be very systematic and very ordered. And so look at everything around you. If you can establish an ordered life, that a lot of people were talking this morning about the difficulty of waking up, but if you wake up at a certain time and then you automatically, that's your time for meditation, and you create that little window that you know nothing else is going to get in the way, and then you go on to your job. And then if you look around the community, there are several long meditations going on every week that you can plug into, but you have to build them into an ordered, systematized life. If it's just kind of, oh God, what time am I going to get up today? And oh boy, I have to get to work. And of course you won't find time for longer, deeper meditations. But if you really try to make your life ordered and organized, then you'll find it a lot easier to go deep in meditation. When you sit to meditate, you think, oh, I know I've got a nice hour here. I don't have to be thinking about, when I'm going to get up and what I need to do. And deeper meditations lead to longer meditations. Okay, the second question on this is, sometimes I'm going to put my glasses on. Otherwise. Sometimes we see what we need to change inside ourselves, but the change doesn't always happen, or maybe it takes a long period of time. We may carry on for years on the same repeating patterns, even knowing their existence. How do we actually make the change and transform ourselves once we see a pattern or attitude? Well, the short answer is we don't. God does. I remember some years ago, I was working on a particular issue, and I was very frustrated because I just didn't feel like I was making any headway. And I went to see Swamiji, and I said, Swami, I'm doing everything I know how. I am visualizing, I am praying, I am affirming, I am meditating, I am, just everything I can think of. And it's just right there in my face. And he kind of smiled, and he said, oh, ultimately, these things are just God's grace. And that was all he said. And I thought, well, it doesn't do me much good. But what he was essentially saying, and Nitai was saying it this morning too, about Master putting on a heavy, uncomfortable overcoat. What you'll find is if you keep working at something, its tentacle grips on you begin to ease up. And it isn't like one day you wake up and you think, I am free, although that can happen if you put out enough energy. And that's another point we'll get to. But usually what happens, it's sort of like water dripping on a stone, and that water is our sincere desire to be freed of that habit. And little by little by little, that stone is eroded, and you go back in a few years and you see it's much smaller, and you go back in a few more years and you see it's kind of dissolved. And so if we can just have patience and realize that God, our sincere, consistent effort comes from God. He's on our side. He's trying to free us. He is our own higher self. He knows more than we do what the potential for our freedom and joy is, and he's just living for us. I was going to say he's just dying for us to get there, but he's just living for us to get there. But then the other thing is, remember when Master was going to buy Mount Washington, and people said, oh, it'll take you 20 years to raise the money to buy that property. And he said, 20 years for people who think 20 years, 20 months for people who think 20 months, 20 days for people who think 20 days. I choose to do it now. And he was able to raise the money in a very short period of time. And what's the difference? It's the amount of energy you put out. So when we practice Kriya Yoga, we need to understand that a lot comes up, and it isn't always pretty. And that's why Master says very strongly, after you do your Kriya practice, sit for a long time before you get up. Otherwise, you're releasing those vrittis, but they're just activating. If after your practice Kriya, if you can hold your mind powerfully at the point between the eyebrows, that's when you burn them up. That's part of the great power of Kriya. And the more you can concentrate there with depth, you don't have to be thinking about, oh, I need to get over anger. Just hold your mind at the point between the eyebrows, and that power will cauterize all these little weeds that are growing in the garden of your consciousness. So by God's grace, ultimately it happens, but the more energy we put out, the faster we'll draw that grace to get over those things.
I'm going to amplify that last point just very briefly, that as you put out more energy, it raises the consciousness. problems are not solved on the same level of consciousness in which they were created. And that's why we can have repetitive issues like tapes that run in our mind for years and years, as long as we're on the same level of consciousness where those questions or problems were created or the blocks exist, we won't get over them. But raise the consciousness a little bit, and it isn't so much that the answers come, it's that the questions disappear. And so it's much better to try to breathe your way sometimes out of repetitive questions, or walk your way out, or, of course, the best, to meditate your way out by bringing your consciousness here than to think repetitively about them. Okay. She points out,
That's yours.
that's mine. She says, it even has my name written on it with her handwriting. So that proves it. Can you address the question of world peace and how to achieve it? And, well, I'll take the next one successively after this. But first of all, let me say about world peace that right now we're in a period that seems extremely tenuous and filled with conflict and filled with warfare and violence and terrorism. And it certainly is, but there have certainly been worse periods in history. Partly what we're seeing is the result of an excessive media attachment to promoting the fact that there's discord around the world. And so every little incident is used as a way to sell newspapers or to sell TV programs. And the sheer amount of world conflict right now is less than it has been at most times in history. The promotion of that conflict is greater. That does not say that there isn't a huge amount of tension in the common consciousness in the world today. There is a lot of inner conflict. Outer conflict comes from inner conflict. People look for outer causes. People are trying to take over territory, or there are religious fanatics, or there are class warfare or economic strata warfare, and that's the cause. None of that is the real cause. The real cause of conflict in the world is conflict in the self. And so what we have to do to overcome world conflict is we have to work on the consciousness of individuals. Some years ago, during the first Iraq invasion, Devi and I were in Minneapolis and staying with with two very good friends of mine who are quite liberal politically, and they were very anti-war, and they wanted us to go out and join in an anti-war demonstration where people were walking down the street banging on pots and pans as an anti-war demonstration. And we kindly told them that we actually preferred not to do that, but what we would do is we would stay home and meditate during that time for world peace. Well, I think our way is better, frankly, that the creation of world peace inside oneself is at least claiming that ground of one person, and that consciousness spreads. There's a sense that if enough people meditating together can create a consciousness, and it doesn't take, there have been experiments with a TM movement where they moved into a small town in the northeast somewhere, I think Rhode Island, Providence. And because it was, Rhode Island was a small state with a relatively small population, and quite a number, a couple of thousand moved into that area. And meditating together and working together, the number of incidents of violence went down. The crime, other kinds of crime went down. The weather improved. There were a number of measurable changes that happened from that. And so that sense of consciousness goes out. So what is Ananda's part in this? And this is very important because world peace cannot be achieved passively. It must be achieved actively. But we can help achieve that by what we're doing in several ways. One is that we end almost every group meditation. In fact, I would say all group meditations end with a visualization and a prayer for world peace. So from that state of calmness and interior change that we have produced in our own consciousness through meditation, we're sending that vibration out into the world, and receptive hearts will pick up on it. Even non-receptive hearts will feel it, but perhaps not be as changed by it. Then we need to also, as well as that, we need to take active part in world peace. That's one of the reasons that we have worked so hard on creating an internet website and an online presence. Last year, we had over 250,000 new visitors to the Ananda website. And on that, you can get talks by Swami Kriyananda and other ministers. You can get pictures. You can get many, many books that you can read, thousands of articles. Bharat has a wonderful site for supporting meditation, and so on. In addition to the number of people that came, people from 204 different countries came. I didn't even know there were 204 different countries. But with that energy going out, constantly promoting the idea of world peace and change of consciousness, it does have a real effect in the world. The other things that we're doing is, it could have slipped by, Nitai talking about the going in and with the high school boys and doing service projects in town. And the story he told about, does it really help? And then, of course, this young man told him how much it had helped him personally. But that sense of putting out actual service to others in a tangible way is very, very important. That is much more important than trying to create world peace by adding to conflict in some way, by fighting against those who are not peaceful. Swami tells a kind of story of why he learned Italian, and it's because he had a translator who, I'm talking here about our vibration is more important than the words we say. And Swami said that he was talking to the audience and he was leading them, and he said, "Feel the peace." And the translator, "Senti di pace!" And Swami realized that he had to learn the language because the vibration that we put out is more important than the form in which that vibration is put out. And so in all these ways, Ananda, in what we send out in the website, in having dozens and dozens of meditation groups and centers around the country and groups of people that are working in this way, it is a very, very important part of creation of world peace. And we must actively, all of us, we really do have the responsibility, having been given these great teachings, to hold in our own consciousness a vision of world peace and to work actively to produce that.
There's a kind of a related question, and I'll just address that quickly. What benefits are there to the world for the enlightened people of Ananda to stay here in this community? Well, the answer to that is we aren't. We are all over the world. We have communities, 6 communities in America, a large international community near Assisi, Italy, where I think there are about 10 different nationalities represented. And we're starting to work in India, of course. They've been there for the past 5 years in the north and in the south. And we have teachers going out all over all the time. Pranaba Hansen, who's in charge of our meditation groups, recently sent me a calendar for the teachers on the road in the next 6 months. And there are 83 different programs going out, either Kriya initiations in Argentina and Mexico City, or just talks and visiting meditation groups. But this is sort of like home base, but it's more like a launching pad, and it's from here that teachers and groups and communities are disseminated all over the world. So that's the answer to that.
Also, a certain quantity of people have more power when their energy is together than when it's dispersed, kind of a critical mass. When you want to create an explosion with uranium, you need to get a critical mass together. And so for community especially, you need a critical mass. So we could, in theory, take the 250 people that live here at Ananda Village and disperse them. But if the 250 people living here, each one went to one of the largest 250 cities in the country and was there alone, would it have the same power to change mass consciousness that it has when we're here as an example? I don't think so. And so there's a certain amount, but after a certain amount, you also need to supply seeds to produce critical mass in other places.
And you need to understand what we mean by critical mass, not critical.
Yes, not critical. And not mass in the Catholic sense either.
Okay, this one's to me, so I'll take this. Earlier in the week, in your class, Devi, you mentioned that Master recommended not sharing your spiritual experiences with other people. Can you please elaborate on the reasons for this? Well, I think there's one primary reason, and that's your spiritual experiences are very personal. And it's just like if you had a very, very dear friend, a companion, and the person confided into you something that was very, very meaningful and very personal and private, and then you just ran out and said, "Guess what so-and-so just told me?" Well, it would be dishonoring that friendship. It would be dishonoring that relationship. And so our relationship with God is also like that. It's remember earlier in the week we talked about this missionary Frank Laubach, who began the practice. We used him as an example of trying to start 5 minutes a day, just thinking of God, and then building it till it took all his day, his waking hours. Well, Catherine Van Houten, whose parents were actually missionaries in China, met Frank Laubach, and they were at some kind of a gathering for Christian missionaries around the world, and someone asked him if he would say the prayer before they had their lunch. And her father, who was a man, obviously dedicating his life to service in China of spreading Christianity, obviously a very sincere spiritual person, said it was the most extraordinary experience to hear him simply say that blessing before the meal, because he said it was as though we had interrupted a conversation he was having with God. And it was just so, it was so intimate and so personal. So on the one hand, your relationship with God it's precious, and it's not something that you want to just talk about. But then also, you will find that if you share these things, and it's too bad, but it's the truth, and I've made this mistake often myself, thinking it wouldn't happen, and it always does. If you share them, they lose their power. They lose the blessing. Because God's saying, I gave that to you. And you can share it in another form. You can share it through joy, through service, through love, through compassion. But the experience between you and me, that was between you and me. And so it loses the spiritual power if you share it. And, Swami Kriyananda, who for all the world just appears like a very kindly elderly gentleman until you look a little more deeply. But, he talks about spiritual experiences that he had with Master, 40 and 50 years ago. And then you think, well, what happened? It kind of leveled off after that? No, I don't think so. I think he just doesn't talk about them, but he transmutes those experiences into his service to the world. So take that energy, hold it within, and you'll find if you articulate it and verbalize it and express it to someone else, it's like water through your hands. Then you can't access it anymore. You can't reach it anymore. And it becomes a mental memory, but not a living experience. And I can see people nodding. I think you've had that experience yourself. Okay.
Also, just very briefly, many people who share do so out of a tainting of ego. I had this great experience, but of course, they won't put it that way. But nonetheless, it is often tainted with a sense of, look at me, I'm special because I've had this experience. When Swami writes about many of his experiences with Master, he puts it, a disciple once asked the question, or a disciple once was talking to Master. He doesn't say it was me. And by that means, he helps impersonalize it. So,
just one more thing to add on that, because it's interesting. I love this statement Master made when he said, "Some of my detractors are saying that I've lost my powers. I don't know that I ever had any powers." I mean, this is an avatar, a man whose soul was totally united with God. So, these things, the greatest power to a siddhi to have is just an overwhelming, total self-surrendering love for God, and the rest is just all smoke and mirrors.
also, the more deeply you go, the less you're there in the picture. There's a beautiful story. It's a little bit long, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Vivekananda, who was considered the most advanced disciple of Ramakrishna, both of them great, great, great souls. There was a time in Vivekananda's life when he was a teenager, and his father died. And he was already a disciple of Ramakrishna, but now he had the responsibility of taking care of his family. And so he said that his father was a fairly well-off business person, but he went and tried to get the money back that his father had loaned. Nobody would pay him back. He tried to get jobs. Nobody would give him a job. He walked around so far that he wore holes in the bottoms of his shoes with no success at all in finding ways to support his family. So finally, in kind of desperation, he went to Ramakrishna and he said, "Sir, I know that you have an intimate, clear communication with Divine Mother. When you speak with her tonight, will you ask her to please help me in this situation?" And Ramakrishna said, "All right." And then in the morning, Vivekananda said, "Well, did you speak with her? What did she say?" And Ramakrishna said, "I forgot." And this happened 3 or 4 nights in a row.
Speak with her.
I spoke with her, but I forgot to ask your question. And so this happened 3 or 4 nights in a row. And Vivekananda was getting a little bit frustrated with this inability on the part of Ramakrishna to do the important things. And so Ramakrishna said, "Well, let me have tonight you speak with her instead. And so he transferred some power to Vivekananda, and he had a vision of the Divine Mother, and was speaking with her. And in the morning, Ramakrishna said, "Did you ask her about the job?" "I forgot." And so in that uplifted state, the consciousness is different and the priorities are different. And in fact, within a couple of days, another disciple of Ramakrishna's came forward and took on the responsibility of supporting the family. And they were taken care of. I'm sure Ramakrishna knew that. Probably Vivekananda did too. They were probably playing out the drama for our benefit more than for theirs. But in those elevated states, the priorities change completely. And so my ways are not your ways, saith the Lord. Okay. Monday class. Have I remembered correctly? Jyotish was speaking about why we don't remember all of our past incarnations. He paraphrased an answer Master said, if we remembered all of our past incarnations and the ongoing monotony therein, we would quickly get out of it, and it would be too fast. Well, what's wrong with that? Whether or not I'm clear on what was said, please address this. Yeah, what's wrong with it? I agree. I've often asked Master the same question. Come on, help out a little bit. But none of the saints who've gotten out seem to think that it was unfair. Once they've gotten out, they do getting there. And well, I shouldn't say that, because sometimes Master said he would argue with God even after he'd long been enlightened. Why do you do it this way? And it does seem somewhat frustrating, but the very question arises only from a standpoint of ego. Once you're united, the question disappears. Why did it take so long? It's all, and who was going through it in the first place? It wasn't, I'm going through it and you didn't help me. You were the only one going through it in the first place. You are me. And so God has played this drama out. And until we can't really mentate it, I think it's a little bit like a third grader who's learning to play chess and has a difficult time learning how the pieces move, becoming frustrated with why the game is so difficult. And why don't we change the whole game and make it easier? Let's get rid of chess and make it into checkers. I know how to play checkers and it's a lot easier. Well, that may be true, but the chess master doesn't want to play checkers. You know, there's a certain enjoyment in the accomplishment of something that seems difficult. And that's trivial. Chess is trivial. But enlightenment and Maya and the achieving of that. And Master often talked about what a sense of enormous joy there is when after all this apparent struggle comes the realization or the fulfillment of that which we've been struggling for. And so from our standpoint, yes. And in fact, I think it is good to kind of metaphorically shake our fist at God and say, Master said sometimes he would pray to Divine Mother, you got me into this, you have to get me out of this. And I think it's good to pray in that way in some cases. On the other hand, we also have to accept that God, who created this world, knew what he was doing when he created it. God, who created delusion and the drama in the way that he did it for a purpose, and that we just have to be accepting of that, even if we aren't totally thrilled by the apparent length of the time that it takes.
This question is, when Yogananda speaks to God, can you tell me what form that it takes, verbal or intuitive? He says that God answers him, and it seems as though they are having a conversation. I've also read that we are supposed to tease or joke with God. Well, there's a beautiful poem. I think it's a prayer that's actually on one of the recordings that we have of Yogananda, where he says, "No more with words, but with the deepest yearnings of my soul do I pray to you." So what we start off with words, but just as with Frank Laubach, the more our relationship with God becomes magnetized by our own deep sincerity and our own deep mental absorption, those words can either remain words, just as when they asked Frank Laubach to speak, and it seemed like we were just interrupting a conversation he was having, an interior conversation he was having with God. Or it can be only kind of an intuitive, wordless communion. I can't put it into words. Just as when Swamiji first met Master, he describes that incident in the path where he said he was inwardly praying to Master to accept him, and he said, "You know my anguish. You know my deep, earnest." He was just mentally thinking this. "You know my deep desire for you to accept me. Don't make me put it into words. I will only start crying." And Master, of course, accepted him. But so there's, in a way, it doesn't really matter. What's important is through our absorption, through our love, through our one-pointed desire to break the silence, break through that veil, go through the glass ceiling, whatever image you want to use. But if we keep calling, and if we keep speaking to God and saying, "Maybe you're not answering me, but I'm talking to you, and I'm going to keep talking, even though I never hear a response." And so through our continual desire to have that conversation, and then we little by little begin to feel the response. Now, you also asked, it seems as though they were having a conversation, and it seemed that God answered him. Well, remember that Master said, "I never ask anything for myself." So it wasn't like, when are you going to give me the money so that we can pay off this property, or when are you going to send me, and nothing like that. In fact, once he was towards the end of Master's life, he was having a lot of physical problems and he couldn't walk. And so one of his close disciples was trying to commiserate and said, "How can Divine Mother treat you like this after all you've done for her?" And Yogananda got I don't think he got irate, truly, but he responded with a great deal of force. And he said, "Don't you dare talk against Divine Mother." So in other words, what she gives, I take, lovingly, acceptingly. And so his prayers, if they were answered, it was at that level of attunement, you only ask what is God's will. And in fact, Swami asked the Master in that first conversation, when Master asked him, "Will you give me your complete obedience, cooperation?" And Swami said, "Well, what if I think you ask me something that I don't feel is right to do?" And Master said, "I will never ask anything you except that it's God's will." And so answered prayers on that level are just more being a channel for divine will into the world. And it isn't like you're trying to improve your lot in life. And then finally, you ask, I have also read that we're supposed to tease or joke with God. Well, the beauty of it is that every single one of us has a different relationship with God. And for some, there's the beautiful story about Saint Teresa of Avila, who was a great saint, Master said, a saint in our line, and spent her whole life founding monasteries and training people in the spiritual path. And towards the end of her life, when she was quite elderly and very frail in health, she was traveling to start a new monastery, a new convent. And this was, in medieval times, and she was crossing a river that was swollen from rains. And she had a little horse, and she was riding a horse, and the water came. Or maybe it was a horse, maybe it was a horse-drawn cart. I can't remember exactly. It's not that important. But the waters came and washed her off, and the sisters stood aghast on the bank watching this great saint being pulled under the water, this little old lady, and finally she was washed up on the other shore. And in that moment, the other bank, she saw Christ, and she said, "Lord, why did you let this happen to me?" And he said, "Don't feel so bad, Teresa. This is how I treat all my friends." And she teased him back, and she said, "Ah, my Lord, that's why you have so few." But that was her relationship. And that it's so delightful to hear that. But not all of us, each one of us. Some of us have a teasing, playful relationship. Some of us would have a more withdrawn, serious. Like I can't imagine Sri Yukteswar having a teasing relationship with God. Maybe he did, but you would think more it was like this great depth and impersonal nature. So the important thing is you find how to speak to God in the language of your own heart, just who you are, just as what's important to you. A number of years ago at a Christmas Sunday service, I talked about a book that I had read when I was a little girl that made this huge impression on me. And then somebody actually had a copy of it. It's a children's story. And they gave me this old beat-up book, but it's called The Littlest Angel. And it was about this little boy. It takes place in heaven. And there's the littlest angel is a little boy who's just died and gone up to heaven, but he still misses the earth. And he has this little box, and in his little box there's a little bird's nest, and there's some robin's eggs, and there's, just little treasures that he brought with him from earth. And then in the story, the Christ child is born, and the angels are all going to go and give a present to the Christ child. And the littlest angel goes and he gives him the present of his treasures, the robin's egg. And, then he looks, and in front of the Christ child, there's, gold and all the great treasures. And the Christ child just smiled at him and said, "These are my favorite." And so that was the language of that little soul, a robin's egg and a bird's nest. So it's whatever is sweet and dear and meaningful to you, that's what you give to God. And if you, just as we were talking earlier, if it's just between the two of you, it's all the more sweet. Now we want to try to end by 8:30 was our goal.
Yes, but I'm going to add a little bit.
Oh.
Just a little bit. If, it's all one. If you were having a dream at night and one of the characters in the dream was joking or teasing, would you feel, what right does that character have to tease and joke in my dream? You can just enjoy it. And if one of the characters was shaking its fist at you and saying, "Wake me up, you'd love that character all the more for doing that. It's all just a dream of God's. And as Devi said, just be sincere in who you are, and as uplifted and as self-offering as you can to God, and don't worry about the form of it.
I'll just add
Okay.
one more little thing. And then
See, we spur each other on, egg each other on.
I've told some of you this, but not all of you have heard. I have a very dear friend. We have a very dear friend who is a direct disciple of Anandamoy Ma. She's an American woman, but she spent many years in India in Anandamoy Ma's ashram at her feet. Great woman saint mentioned in the autobiography. And so some years ago, Haripriya was going to go to India to visit Anandamoy Ma, and I hadn't ever been to India. And I said to her, and I just loved reading about Anandamoy Ma from the autobiography and other books, and I wanted to send her a present. And I thought, well, what do you send Divine Mother? A beautiful gold sari or a diamond necklace, or gold bangles, or what could you send her? What could be good enough for her? And I asked Haripriya, and she said, well, in India, this was maybe 30 years ago, she said, in India, it's really hard for them to get good quality cooking oil. Why don't you send a bottle of really nice cooking oil, and then she'll be able to cook with it? And I thought, cooking oil? To Divine Mother? But I did it, and I went to the store and got a real nice bottle of refined oil. And Haripriya said, she was really appreciative that she got that. But it was so personal. It was so dear because it was just like every day, and I've always loved to cook. And, it made it all the sweeter because I was sharing with Divine Mother the cooking oil. And
One time I was with... This is the last part of this. I had the blessing to be with Anandamoy Ma for 3 days. And the first night she was just barely there, just like as distant as the stars. And line of people were going up, and she barely, as if she didn't even recognize that she was on this earth plane. A couple of days later, there was a little satsang with about 20 or 30 people. She was up on a little dais as if she were sitting here, but a little higher. And we all were there, and Swami was in the front row. And she had a little garland of marigolds that was around her neck that someone had given her. And she took that, she just went like that and threw it, and it went around Swami's neck like a lasso. And she laughed and clapped her hands. And she had some candies in a handkerchief brought out, and she threw it to each one of us, and just playing like she was just our closest friend. And so the bhav of a saint is just however God wants to play through at that particular time. Okay. Please say something about letting go of family in order to dive into the spiritual path. We have to grow kind of in stages. And one of the stages where everybody experiences it is that growing up in a family is comforting usually. I'm talking about a normal, functional family now. Is comforting and...
got a lot of funny expressions
Yeah.
on that one.
What's he mean by that? Yeah.
In theory.
Yeah. It's normally very supportive for most people, but there comes a time when it's also enclosing because the parents' expectations, even if they're quite liberal, I had wonderful parents, very liberal, very much concerned with my benefit, my welfare, yet they had certain mindsets that didn't allow for the growth in the way that I needed it. And I needed to break away from that and then be able to come back having broken those kinds of mental restrictions. It doesn't happen for everybody, but it's a very common cultural occurrence. We had a much, much more difficult time getting started in Italy than we did in America because the sense of family was so strong and the sense of breaking away from the family tradition was so negative. I met one woman there, a young woman. She was, 25 at the time or something like that. And she had come to some lectures of Swami, and she really wanted to be on the spiritual path. She wanted to do something, maybe come to a community. Her family had had a perfume store in Florence since the 1500s. and she was the last member of the family. And if she would leave that, it would break a tradition. I mean, she was the heir of that. It would break a tradition that was 500 years old. And that being locked into that old tradition is very difficult to break out of it. So very often you need to break away from that. When the monks and nuns came to Mount Washington under Master's direction, he did not want them to contact their family except very briefly, maybe a Christmas card or something like that, but no real contact for at least a year. And then they could come and ask permission from him to have more, just to break away from that. So very often we need to break away from the family unless there's the rare blessing, which we do have in this community, of having multiple generations. If your parents are yogis, then you don't need to break away. I've always been amused. We have, well, I'll say the name. We have a 3-generation family with Gloria and her daughter Narani and their son. And one time we asked Gloria, who's nearing 80 now, this was probably 10 years ago that we asked her. We said, were your other children, were they upset when you moved to Ananda? She said, no, none of my children. It didn't bother them, but my mother was upset. And so there is somehow kind of a tentacle aspect to the family that needs to be broken, at least psychically. And then once that's broken, then we also need to continue to love and honor our parents. But you read in the autobiography of a yogi that even Sri Yukteswar, great avatar that he was, would visit his mother, and his mother would essentially tell him, you're not going to tell me what's right and wrong. I still see you as my little child. And so it takes stepping away, but then once you step away and break those psychic bonds, the heart connection should still be kept.
I'll say something before Jyotish gets more ideas, and then he's just collecting them over there. I just want to add one thing, because I think also implied in this question is about the family life and children and the obstacle of children on the spiritual path. Well, I think the really important thing for all of us, if you're married or single or have children or don't have children or have pets or don't have pets or, whatever it is that you're trying to do what God wants you to do. And if that's to raise a child, then that's your spiritual path. If it's to be a monk or a nun and not have any children and live alone, then that's your spiritual path. But it's more than any form, it's what do you want me to do? What do I need to do to find you and to please you? And if you find yourself, people can be just as selfish, living, well, I'm going to find God and I'm going to live in a little cell and then all they think about are themselves. I'm looking at Virani, and I don't want to embarrass you, but I just get such a kick out of her with her goats, just watching her, because it's like they're her family and she is pouring so much love into them. And you can think, well, those are just goats. Well, it's what she's doing it not just as goats, and you can tell she's serving God in those little creatures, and it's beautiful and inspiring. And we thank you for bringing those Jenny and the goats to this community. But there's a beautiful story illustrating this thought of the path to God is not the form, but it's doing what God wants of us at any particular time. There was a very story from India. There was a very, very devoted soul, truth seeker, and he had a lovely wife, And but he just always said, Lord, whenever you want me to leave this worldly life and go to the Himalayas and live only for you, you call me. You call me. I'll come in a moment. And so he was married and had very much devoted to his wife and she to him. And then some time went by, and she was going to have a child. But when the child was born, this lovely wife died in childbirth. And so he took the little baby and he said, well, I will raise this child. And he said, and I'll make sure that this child is protected and cared for and given the best things I'm able to give. Just at that moment, he heard God calling him, my child, now it's time for you to leave everything and come to me. And this devotee said, Lord, I have made this pledge to you, and I will not break it, but I have a human heart. You must reassure me that you will take care of my child. And he put the child down in a basket along the side of the road, and he went behind a tree, and he watched. And God told him, he said, have faith, I will take care of this child. And he put the child down in a basket, and then off in the distance he saw this retinue coming, and it was the daughter of the king of the realm, the princess, and she was coming with her attendants, and she stopped and she saw this beautiful little child by the side of the road. She looked around and she said, I will take this child and I will raise him in my palace as my own. And then the father, with his calmed heart, was able to go away and serve God. But the point is, the spiritual path is doing what we're asked to do, whatever form it takes, whatever other people may think, doesn't matter. If we know this is what God asked us to do, then that's how we'll find him. And there's a beautiful quote from Sister Gyanamata where she said, if you cannot find God in the exact spot where you are now, where in all the world will you find him? So look at your life. Really, the whole point of this week is to deepen your life as it is and find God in the experiences God has given you, in the people in your life, in the way you serve, in your own humanity. Find God in that moment.